Probationers at St. Pemberley's, a Pride and Prejudice variation. By Amaritta Beane. Copyright Amaritta Beane. No unauthorized reproductions allowed. All rights reserved to the author. No inspirations for characters drawn from real-life individuals, no resemblance to real individuals intended. Probationers at St. Pemberley's. First edition January 9, 2023. Copyright 2023 Amaritta Beane. Written by Amaritta Beane. Probationers at St. Pemberley's. A Pride and Prejudice variation. By Amaritta Beane. Chapter 1. It is a fact bemoaned by young nurses the world over, that the first day of a new probationer's training at one of our grand old teaching hospitals is a baptism of fire to test the hardiest soul. The nurses of St. Pemberley's training school, and certainly the latest intake, proved no exception to this habitual rule. On this day, early in the first semester of their first year of training, an observer might have found them filing into the nursing school lecture theatre for a thrilling disquisition upon cardiovascular histology. Elizabeth Bennet, one of the aforementioned group, and a dark-eyed demure damsel of 20 years, was amongst them. A little late to the party, and seeking a place on the hard lecture theatre benches where she might find it, she found herself separated from her friends. Emma Woodhouse, waving from the front bench, her charming blue-eyed doll-like face lit with a beaming smile, and Fanny Price, shyly tucked in at the very end of the middle row, with the slight confusion and depression of spirits upon her countenance which Elizabeth was often at pains to dispel. Instead, she discovered herself squeezed in alongside a bevy of comely young women known, in undertones, by herself and her friends as the husband hunters — blonde and horsey young women of the Sloane Square set, out to marry a medicant with precious little interest in actual nursing. Well, quite a nice-looking orangutan, this young woman qualified pleasantly. I expect I do look familiar, she added. You'll have seen me about the classrooms and halls of residence. I'm a second year. Having to retake this damned probationer class, the entire lecture series, she said, sighing slightly. I failed it last year, my brother was sick, and I was dashing up and down between London and Derbyshire the entire time. Oh, I'm so sorry, Elizabeth said politely. I do hope he's better now. It was true, now that the girl had mentioned it, Elizabeth could recall seeing her hustling about the hospital corridors, generally in a tight-knit little group of buddies, smirking and chattering with flashing eyes and loud voices. He's a menace, this young woman replied, with an expressive bulge of the eyes that was less unflattering than it ought to have been. She was a good-looking doxy, altogether, with a pulse-speedingly reckless air. He ought to be proscribed by law, but unfortunately there isn't the statute yet written that can contain Harry Crawford. The blighter. That sounds like wisdom born of long experience, Elizabeth said, with a laugh. I have nothing but sisters myself, so I'm not equipped to wax satirical upon the subject of brothers. Is he at the hospital, too? A medical student, or a doctor? Oh, good Lord, no, this insouciant creature replied airily, apparently finding the very idea amusing. Not that he didn't give it the good old college try. And to do him justice, he's quite clever enough to have qualified, head boy, scholarship to Cambridge, aced his first-year exams, the works. But the lure of the spotlights is what got him, or the spotlight, singular, you might say. Perhaps you've heard of him. He's a bit of an up-and-comer on the London stage, and recently he had a bit part in Deductions of Darkness, terribly grim moody police drama, made quite a splash with the critics. Second fiddle to Dirk Bogarde, of course, but that's not too shabby. Who would complain about that? Certainly not me. He's got his sights set on Hollywood, of course. Ring any bells? He goes by Henry. Professionally, his agent thought that Harry was too terribly common and proletarian for words. That said, you can't blame the snobby swine. Harry really isn't exactly a man of the people, no matter what kitchen sink drama ambitions he might have. Too funny for words, my love. Henry Crawford, the name did ring a bell, quite distinctly, in Elizabeth's mind. And then in a flash she had it, and remembered it clearly. Why, she said, delighted, is that the same Henry Crawford who played Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing at the Old Vic last year? Why, he was marvellous. My sisters thought so too. In fact, they dragged me back twice more to see the production again, not that I needed a great deal of persuasion. It was a wonderful production, but he was the best thing in it, absolutely the star of the show. Well, for heaven's sake don't tell him so, her neighbor advised her crossly. He certainly doesn't need any assistance in getting a swelled head, or a more swelled head, I should say. Speaking as his sister, that's something he, and I, can well do without. Mary Crawford, by the way, the relatively obscure and long-suffering sibling. Oh, I'm Elizabeth Bennet, Elizabeth countered politely. But privately, she was forming the opinion that this Mary Crawford was the very last girl to languish in obscurity for long, relative or not. Bennet, Mary Crawford mused for a moment, and then she got a positive glint in her fine dark eye. Now, I do think I may spy out a familial resemblance. Would that make you any relation to Jane Bennet? My sister, Elizabeth confessed, smiling. She's a third year, now, will soon be qualified. Oh, I know, my dear, Mary Crawford said blandly. I know her quite well, a dear girl. You're fortunate in your siblings, I'm quite jealous. Well, in some of them, Elizabeth qualified this, with a private smirk. But Mary Crawford's attention had been stolen away, and she was now watching the staff doorway to the lectern of the lecture theatre. A tall, dark-haired young man was striding through it, pushing a hand through his hair and with an absent, preoccupied look on his handsome face. His dark suit was very fine, and having been coached upon the subject by her father, Elizabeth knew a good suit when she saw one. But although well-dressed, he was a little unkempt, and there was, too, that in his face that suggested he had better things to do than to deliver a lecture on the cardiac potentials of slices of heart muscle to a cohort of massed probationer nurses, wet behind the ears. Elizabeth was scrambling for her file of notes on the term's lectures and the handbook for this year's educational requirements, when Mary Crawford dug her in the ribs with quite an impressively sharp elbow. There he is, she hissed at Elizabeth, not with any noticeable level of discretion. What do you think? The matron's heart throb, every senior sister's secret bash, but I don't rate him as so very dishy myself, even if he is number one on the hit parade with the entire St. Pem's School of Nursing, eh? Who is he? Elizabeth hissed back, flicking through her course handbook. I can't remember, Darcy. Mary returned, sounding just a tad exasperated. Who else? What, you've not heard of him yet? This received a mute nod from Elizabeth, as the said gentleman lowered the lights in the lecture theatre. Heavens, Mary said, with a shrug comprehensive of much indeed. In shorthand, Fitzwilliam Darcy, Esquire. Appallingly rich, intellectually brilliant, the youngest senior consultant surgeon that St. Pemberley's has ever seen, and the foremost sprig of the Darcy family, who built St. P's as their grand palatial home eons back, then endowed it in trust as a gift to the National Health Service, back when Nye Bevan and his cronies were cobbling it together post-war. Old Ma and Pa Darcy were hot stuff in the Fabian Society at Cambridge, back pre-war when they were dewy young undergrads, not just your actual aristocracy, but also aristocrats of socialism. How's that for a resume, eh, girlie? Elizabeth was appropriately impressed, and Mary's brief biography of the chap played upon her mind as the lecture began. Mr. Darcy stood at the front of the lecture theatre, to the side of the lectern, and looked out impatiently at the flower of young womanhood obediently waiting for his wisdom. Elizabeth felt his gaze pass over her, and move on, unengaged, and so for all of them, none of them worthy of his concentrated attention. Perhaps he paused a little, hitching at the sight of Mary Crawford, but only for the very barest second. Good morning, ladies, he greeted them, without emotion. You are embarking upon a noble profession, serving the sick and the needy. I applaud you for your choice. However, it falls to me to take responsibility for a considerable portion of your education. You will need rigorous tutoring in order to be a blessing and a benison to your suffering patients, rather than a danger to man or beast, as much a potential manslaughterer as any dangerous driver upon the public highway. I shall be relying upon your cooperation in this endeavor. But be warned, he added, with a sudden sharp look about the auditorium from under his straight dark brows, that any young woman who thinks that nursing is a trivial job, consisting merely of holding patients' hands, emptying the odd bedpan, and simpering at whatever young doctor takes her fancy, who thinks she need not knuckle down and study hard, and work harder than seems possible or tolerable, and still may skate through her end-of-year exams, then that young woman is in for a severe shock. Poor results in your exams are viewed with a distinctly jaundiced eye, and by no means all of the young women who plough their first set of exams are allowed to progress and take them a second time. Throwing viable candidates out to the wolves. It was a comforting thought. Elizabeth knew